It's the next morning, and I've block sanded the edges of the hull flush with the bulkhead as needed. There were a few places where it stood a little proud. Mostly it was pretty flush, especially on the bottom, but up in these top panels, there was a little bit that needed sanding. More on the bow panel than the stern panel. This is the stern we're looking at. So I did that. And then when that was done and these panels are flush, you can see the hull here is flush with the bulkhead. I filled in any small gouges like this with some epoxy. Again, this is the stern half. This half is less abraded by the saw than the forward half. Here's the forward half. This is the one place where this was the first gunnel that I cut through. This is the port side. And the saw started to wander right in there where that epoxy is. So it got off track and left a kind of a ridge there. And then I corrected it, and this bottom part is much better. But that needs to be epoxied in and brought back to where it needs to be. So this is the first, kind of the first layer. We'll see how it goes from here. I taped over the gasket groove. I'm just going to leave that for now. I'll clean that up so that it's back to the correct shape later. I taped over the hardware and faired that in right there. Faired in a few small gouges here. And then this side had a little bit of a gouge, but nothing terrible. It's on the inside here. And again, these are all sanded flush. The hull panels are sanded flush with the bulkhead all the way around. And if there hadn't been any saw marks at all, then I'd be moving on with the next step. But I need to get these corners, especially this one here. I need to get that back to where it should be, because the next step is actually sanding a little chamfer in this hull and building a dam and filling it with epoxy. I'll tip the boat back up on the bow and the transom again, on the stem and transom, so that these sides face up, and toughen that edge with epoxy. It's going to be a little fuzzy, but that'll come after I finish up these repairs. So it's a couple days later, over the weekend, and I came in and just kind of touched up one or two of these spots that I had filled the first time, especially this area. Put another quick coat on there, a little bit here and there as needed. And then this morning I sanded this all with a block. So these areas are all nice and flat now, and I'm ready to move on with the next step, which is to chamfer all these hull edges a little bit. They want like a 3/16 inch flat on the hull corners. And then I'm going to create a tape dam and fill that void with epoxy. I'll have to stand the boat up on the stem and transom again to do that. But what this step will do is it creates a harder corner. This plywood corner obviously would not be that hard, and with the exposed edge, I guess over time in the use it might get dinged up. So by kind of creating an epoxy corner that'll then get glassed over, it's going to make it much tougher. So that's what's going to happen next. After sanding those hull edges, this is what we're left with. Got about 3/16 of an inch flat here. Right here. Just a little bit of an angle. And what I'm going to do now is tape over this from the hull side and fill that gap with epoxy. Wasn't too bad to sand this. Goes all the way down around the gunnels, under the gunnels, and down an inch or so on the inside of the bulkhead. Later the bulkhead's going to be dealt with differently. So that's the next step. Here I've created the dam with tape. There's 2 layers of tape on here. I made this in sections, stretched the tape out on a metal ruler, 2 layers at a time, and then installed it on the boat here. Wrapping around the gunnels, over all the edges, everything's overlapped. And there's a gap. It's pressed tight to the hull, but then it's just hanging out in the air. So there's this gap right there. And I'm going to stick a syringe in there and fill that angled void right up. And I let this tape hang out quite a bit. Didn't worry too much about how much, as long as it hung out over the edge. Erred on the side of more versus less, because I didn't want to be too fussy with the tape installation. Worrying about getting it all exactly the same or whatever, it doesn't really matter. What matters is filling that angled void completely with epoxy over full. And then when it's cured, I'll sand it so it's nice and flush and square again. Should end up roughly square with the hull using this method. But there will probably be a little bit of sanding there just to clean it up a little bit when I pull the tape. So there you have it. Put these boats on end and fill that with epoxy. My table is strong enough to walk on, so this time I'm doing this work from on top of the table instead of working off ladders. Worked much better. I could get to both halves at the same time. So I've gone ahead and filled in these gaps I made around the tape dam, all the way around the edges of the boat here. And they are filled, overfilled more than they need to be, just to make sure that there's, oops, there we go. Just to make sure there's plenty of epoxy in there and something to sand flat, so that if it settles down or runs at all, it'll be plenty in there. And I also very carefully used a nail and brought some epoxy around these fastener holes to kind of create a little edge to bring it up to bulkhead level, and then taper it down to the holes in the center. Very careful on these ones in particular, because these are the threaded ones, so that no epoxy goes in there. It's very fussy. And then here's the stern half. Same thing over here. Filled all that edge. And then all of these fastener locations. So that's going to cure now. This is the net result after filling those hull edges that I sanded. So I filled those and let it cure overnight, and then pulled the tape and block sanded them flush with the bulkhead here. And very lightly on the hull side, but the hull side was pretty flush. So these are all square again with the bulkhead. I'll show you up here. So it's nice and square. The whole bulkhead's been lightly sanded just to prepare it for fiberglass. So the fiberglass goes over these edges right to the edge. And that little angled corner of epoxy there will add a lot of kind of strength to the corners of the hull. So when you take it apart and put it together over the years, it's not going to get beat up as much as it might otherwise. So goes the theory. I quote from the book. Next step after finishing up sanding those new epoxy corners was to lay out and install fiberglass. This is 1 layer of 4-ounce cloth. Covers the whole thing. It's trimmed roughly to size. This is just wet out with epoxy and 207 hardener. And then late today I will fill coat this with the same resin. So this will be all smooth. Fill all the weave of the cloth. This is the bow section here. And then here's the stern section, same thing. 1 layer of cloth wet out in place. Kind of pushed it into these hardware areas so that it stuck to the epoxy around the edges. The hardware is slightly recessed but I want the glass to stick to it if possible. And then I'll cut out the center hole once the glass is cured. Same with these overlapping areas. I'll cut that once the glass is cured. Again, this will get fill coated later in the day today. Late in the day, that first layer of fiberglass was cured enough so I could fill coat it. Just the usual extra layer of resin on here to fill the weave of the cloth. This is the stern section here. This is the bow section, fill coated. So here's where we end up finally, after a few days of detail work following cutting the boat in half. These faces are now glassed. The edges are hardened with the epoxy on the corners. And I've lightly sanded these. I'll have to do a little more later because this epoxy is still not fully cured. There's a few heavier spots that are too gummy to really sand flat, but these are basically flat. And as they should be. I used a countersink to just ream out the fastener holes a little bit after I cut the glass out. So those look pretty good. And the gunnels are sanded back to their original profile on all three sides. And I lightly sanded the hull edge where the glass overlapped a little bit. Same thing on the forward half. Cleaned out this gasket notch. The glass had gone right over the top. And I trimmed it back and sanded it. So that'll be ready to accept the gasket when it's time. Same thing with these fastener locations. So these look pretty good. They're nice and flat.